Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today to discuss the key outcomes from COP27 and what they mean for 2023 and also for business and the future beyond us. Today, we're going to have Andrew Hedges, partner from Baker McKenzie's London office. Also, we have David Hackett. He's a senior counsel at Baker McKenzie, Chicago. And I'm a partner at Trench Rossi Watanabe, São Paulo. As I mentioned, we're going to touch today in key aspects related to COP27. So we will start with an overview of the COP outcomes with David. Following that, we will explore and elaborate a little bit more how the discussions developed around Article 6 mechanisms and how it will impact or not the voluntary carbon markets. After that, we're going to explore climate finance, energy transition in emerging markets. And finally, in the end, I will talk a little bit on the interaction of the climate discussions and the biodiversity discussions in the international arena that we are gonna face this month in Montreal. Just some housekeeping notes here. This session is being recorded. All participants are muted and in listen-only mode. And the slides and recording will be made available following today's discussion. So with that, I believe I will pass it over to David. Thank you, David, for your contributions.
Thanks, Renata. I thought if we can move to the next slide, I'll provide an overview of the key outcomes from the negotiations. But before getting to that, Renata and I both were fortunate to attend, as well as some others from Baker McKenzie, the negotiations as observers, in which one applies ahead of time and is sponsored, allowing one as an observer to attend the main events. Increasingly, the COP experience is a collection of multiple events with very different definitions of success from the people who are attending. In the main area, you have, of course, the government negotiations themselves, as well as more than 200 pavilions, kind of like a major trade show, but with each of the pavilions under in multiple buildings, kind of each of them large enough to fit 20 to 100 people for different presentations. So you have pavilions sponsored by governments, NGOs, industry, universities, multilaterals, addressing the spectrum of climate-related issues: ocean energy, biofuels, water and climate, nature-based solutions, emissions trading, industry sector issues like buildings, energy, steel, technology, a big focus on finance, children, climate justice, indigenous people, all offering detailed programs every day, all day, next to each other. Just an incredible amount of events that one might attend, and many of them with kind of very different focuses, purposes, and definitions of success. While that each day probably more than 50,000 people go through the security into that main area, and there's intermingling with people in the negotiations, walking through the pavilion area, country presidents, EU officials like Timmerman. I literally walked into John Kerry as he was meeting with the Ukraine environmental minister. And that's just typical of the of the event. So you have both the negotiations and a whole series of other events with information being exchanged, focused on different aspects of the climate challenge. And outside that main area is side events, an innovation hub and a green hub that had thousands of other people. And in some instances, particularly from the environmental community, quite different perspectives on what success means and how and who ought to be primarily responsible for addressing the major climate challenges. Business was a very large participant, lots of pavilions and programs, kind of talking about commitments and activities and plans going forward. While outside the pavilion area, you had environmental groups much more critical of business and the role that business can play. Overall, one is struck by the widespread interest in addressing climate, an anxiety about the pace, increasing challenges and opportunities and expectations, especially related to business, a noticeable expansion and focus around nature and climate, especially in connection with food and agriculture, that Renata will talk about some more. But both in the events and in the negotiations, there's really three big issues. Pace, how fast? Second, what really are the right measures and approaches? And third, which this COP negotiation addressed a lot, who pays? There's a big emphasis on finance, especially around providing funds from developed countries to the developing countries and how that might work. I mean, I think in general, one would probably give this COP a mixed, modest success. I think it's probably not the most significant COP nor the least, but it's fair to take away from that an expectation, I think, that business in particular is only going to experience more pressure to do more going forward through additional COPs and various government and private sector perspectives. So I don't know, Renata, do you have any overall comments you want to just share about the experience? It's like organized chaos with so many things happening at the same time, right next to each other. It's at moments overwhelming, but just striking the amount of thought and consideration, engagement by so many people around the world.
Yeah, David, I agree with you, and I would maybe highlight 2 points here. One is the fact that since probably last COP at Glasgow, we could see that negotiators are definitely not in a bubble, that the private sector, the NGOs, all stakeholders, they are really very active, and they will be active regardless the outcomes of the negotiations among the parties. So I think that the fact that we have the business so involved and announcing commitments and partnerships is something that is crucial, and it's maybe one of the major outcomes that we have been seeing since Glasgow and now at Sharm-el-Sheikh again. And I see here in our audience some of these good partners that we could discuss relevant matters there. So thank you so much for joining us. And maybe the other point that I would highlight is that the private sector is really taking advantage of the momentum to be more aggressive on the announcement of commitments, even given the difficult times that we are living now in terms of the war at Ukraine and energy security issues. But we see more and more the relevant players from the financial sector, from the private sector really going forward and making these announcements and announcing alliances that will put together important initiatives on forests and energy transition during COP. And I think it's very bold in a sense to do that during COP, because all it's in the spot, and we can see that it's everybody will be paying attention to these commitments, but it's good. I think it's a very important momentum really for the private sector to bring and to bring their efforts to the table and their targets and commitments.
Thanks. With respect to the negotiations themselves, and we'll go into a number of these in greater detail in a minute, but as a starting point, there was a reaffirmation of the importance of trying to get to 1.5. Certainly, there were a number of people who hoped that there might even be a more aggressive outcome than essentially a reaffirmation of that goal, but that's where it ended up. To do so, there was a recognition that there needs to be substantial progress by 2030, including lowering emissions by 43% relative to 2019 levels. And what is becoming kind of a bigger phrase, a notion of moving towards a just transition, which refers to the concept that developing countries should have access to the same socioeconomic and development benefits that the global North has historically enjoyed, while transitioning to a low carbon economy. And basically that's a vehicle through which, among other things, discussion and encouragement about the transfer of technology and finance from the North to the South to both facilitate development and to address climate problems. Next slide. There's a lot of discussion around energy and language related to addressing the unprecedented global energy crisis, but there was a significant debate about whether to include language related to the oil and gas sector, which ended up not being included. And ultimately, the party stuck to the Glasgow language, which references, quote, the phase down of unabated coal power and phase out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, which sidesteps in many ways questions around oil and gas in particular. The parties urged the developed countries to scale up, as I mentioned before, the provision of climate finance, technology transfer, and capacity building for adaptation to the developing country parties. And then probably the topic that was not resolved till the very end and was of a special moment, a particular moment for developing countries, particularly the African region, was an agreement reached on the establishment of funding arrangements to respond to loss and damage. And essentially, the idea is to provide a vehicle by which countries or entities that have created climate problems that impact developing countries should be held accountable in some way for the loss and damage resulting from that. Now, while that was adopted in principle, there is significant opposition with respect to how to implement it, particularly from the US and other major developed countries. And there's much work to be done to see what this actually means and how it would work going forward. Next slide. Just briefly, the next steps and likely focus of attention over the course of the next year. One, scaling up climate finance, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. I think by any measure, though, we're still a long ways away from having climate finance remotely responsive to the scope of the need and the demand. As I said just a minute ago, the Loss and Damage Fund has a lot of work still to be done on it as to what it means and how it's structured. Andrew will talk, Andrew Hedges, in just a minute on Article 6 activities, in which there was both progress and lots of work to be done, particularly over the course of the next year, related to what does 6.2 and 6.4 mean and how are they going to work. And finally, increasing pressure on countries to develop domestic policies, enhancing their climate ambition with some specificity kind of about what that might mean. Our national governments now must set up market-based policies to engage with Article 6.2. In addition to engaging with Article 6 and activities in the international transfer of emission outcomes, the parties also need to implement ambitious domestic policy measures and incentivize broad private sector participation in emission reduction activities. So how this ends up playing out, we'll see, but clearly pressure for governments, particularly in the developed world, to do more to address climate. With that, we'll move to Andrew Hedges to talk about Article 6. And then after that, we'll discuss climate finance and biodiversity. Andrew?
Hi, and hi everyone. Thanks for joining. Look, I'm just going to jump in and have a comment on that last piece, though, in that each time we have a COP, everyone fixates on COP, and we have to have a breakthrough, it seems. And I think that's laudable and important. But also, we have the Paris Agreement. It is about that last point that David just said. It is about domestic implementation of NDCs by countries to deliver what they've promised. And in a way, that's where the spotlight needs to be increasingly, is not just increasing ambition, but what are you delivering on it? How are you delivering it? How can we help you deliver on it? I think these are the critical things. Now, Article 6.4 and Article 6, maybe that is a tool by which we will help countries reach a just transition or otherwise deliver on their NDCs. I guess with this slide, we just wanted to sort of capture, are we there yet? With 6.4, it's a new project-based mechanism, sort of a successor, you could say, to the Clean Development Mechanism. We had a breakthrough moment in Glasgow where a lot of the rules appeared to be agreed, but there was a lot more to be done. So it can seem that it's a question of slow pace and a question of whether we will reach an operational phase quickly. And with here, you can see each of the different pieces of that puzzle. And I think the positive news is that there are good developments across many of these. We have 28 countries around the world now have signed up for their designated national authority. The supervisory board was established, is funded, has an operational work plan. It's had multiple meetings, and it's, some of those have been tense at the end, and we'll touch on why, but it's moving forward. There is delays on some of the methodological developments. There is more work to be done on registries, but it is tracking forward. So if we just go to the next slide, picking up that sort of registry point last, it's an interesting one that probably the biggest takeaway, at least I believe, and others, is what's happened in the discussions under 6.4, because what we had at COP was almost a rerun of arguments that occurred at at the Glasgow COP around really what is the nature of a unit, a carbon unit that's created under 6.4. And where it seemed to come out in Glasgow was, broadly speaking, it could be authorized for an NDC or other international mitigation purposes. So it could have a flexibility of use, but each time that did occur, there had to be a corresponding adjustment by the country in which that emission mitigation or removal occurred. With the idea of sort of balancing the books, if these things are going to be compliance-grade instruments for the purposes of Paris or otherwise, then the country can't create that without sort of making an adjustment to its target, effectively making its target harder. And what we had in Sharm El-Sheikh is a rerun of discussions that I was party to last year, where that was seen as too limiting, and that there could be other purposes for which Article 6.4 might create units that have a real beneficial use. So now we have a situation where you have authorized units, and for authorized units, certain things flow, such as the need to make corresponding adjustments, but a recognition that you can have what's called here mitigation contribution 6.4 ERs, which are some examples are given of what they could be used, but the inter alia words used in the decision are not limiting. There could be other uses, but it is things like results-based financed, or maybe for domestic mitigation tools. So maybe a country sees that actually using the benefit of the methodologies and the tools to generate credits under 6.4 could be very useful, and then applying that back into their own country system rather than seeing it as a trading unit for other markets. So that's, I think, something that you will hear about, and we will be discussing a lot in coming years, because a lot flows out of that. It in some respects, you could say it's akin to a voluntary market, because at the moment voluntary units don't come with corresponding adjustments. So it's almost like you'll have a voluntary set of methodologies, and maybe you can have an Article 6.4, both with similar lack of corresponding adjustments. Or alternatively, some commentators have been really focused on the language of talking about these types of units as only being a contribution to the reduction of emission levels in the country, which sort of plays into some of the critiques people have made around voluntary markets and whether the users of credits should be able to make offset claims, or should they be just saying that they made a financial contribution and the real emission reduction is within country. So interesting stuff. Watch this space. Broadly speaking, and I will move on, there's a bit up there on the slides, but some of the mechanics to get 6.4 going around sort of decisions on issuance fees and the nature of a unit, the serial numbers, indivisibility, all of it, that good progress on that. But if we just move to the next one, just picking on one where we perhaps had less progress, but still interesting developments in the build-up to COP. So critically, you need to have methodologies, you need to have an approach to additionality, you need all of these kind of rules of the road for Article 6.4 to not just be an operational system, but have the guidance by which projects can be developed and brought forward. And there was a whole process that was intended to build up to the COP for the supervisory board to prepare recommendations on things like, okay, what are the methodological approaches to removals, or what is the broad guidance around what is meant by additionality and how do baselines fit within that, et cetera, et cetera. And as you can see on this slide, and I won't go through it, some really interesting stuff, nature-based removal guidance that might include the use of permanence tools such as buffers against reversal risk, which is all drawn directly from the voluntary market, but also looking at carbon sequestration as a methodology. So that fell apart though, because the supervisory board in their final meeting before COP was just unable to reach a decision on that. And they tried in September and they failed again in November. And that meant that there wasn't really the capacity to push a recommendation to COP, which would be then discussed and taken forward. But there is a work plan, particularly on the first one I've been talking to, with a relatively tight process. and multiple stages. So I think it's very positive something will come at next COP. We just have to be patient. And if we just move to the next slide, I want to move then to 6.2. So if you're not living and breathing Article 6, so 6.4 is the project-based mechanism, probably more stuff to be done before you could say that's live and operational, and we'll probably get there in the next, I guess, 2 to 3 years. But there will be sort of real backdating possible, so it won't stop projects being positioned or even sort of CDM transition projects. And then Article 6.2 is intended as the sort of country-to-country type arrangements or similar arrangements. And it is perhaps more capable of being used now because there is a lot more flexibility under that 6.2 mechanism. And what we're seeing is a lot of developments around the world where countries are actually coming together and trying to do these. But this slide, we're just touching on some of the different, I guess, the skeleton or the registry skeleton that has to sit behind them all, where at 6.2, you need the database, you need to tie into an international registry that's being developed. The Article 6.4 mechanism will have a registry on itself, but it has to be interfaced with those others, and 6.8, which I won't touch on today. And you've seen a lot of tension in the negotiations in the build up to COP around, it's a theme that comes up many places, but it's around host countries or developing countries, all countries wanting some flexibility, not wanting everything to be driven through the Secretariat. So when we get into the nuts and bolts of registries, it often talks about, well, registries that meet certain quality standards, but which are ultimately controlled by that host country for host country purposes. If we move on to the next slide, and that theme comes up through a number of the things that were resolved or taken forward this year on 6.2. So to pick one of the topics on here, and I'll come back on some of the others, the expert technical review. You know, think, well, that sounds rather boring, doesn't it, the expert technical review? But the tension there is, this is the tool by which the international community says, well, how do we actually know that if two countries decide they're going to design a cooperative activity under 6.2 and effectively say, this is how we're going to create mitigation outcomes, and then we'll back them by ITMO's, International Transfer Mitigation Outcomes, that's, you know, that's robust and meets the requirements of integrity, because it's not as fixated on rules as 6.4. And the answer to that is the technical review process, which can identify insufficiencies or issues with the design or the implementation of a 6.2 activity. But again, a lot of countries who are pushing back and saying that, you know, you need to respect national sovereignty. It needs to not be sort of revisiting my underlying objectives and design, et cetera, et cetera. So that has resolved itself. It was tense, but it has resolved itself. And there is probably a good balance between the rigor of desktop reviews and the recognition of host country sovereignty and flexibility. Sorry, I know you're trying to move me on there, colleagues, but just one thing that I would also bring out on this slide is this authorization process, which again goes to what level of control should countries have. And authorization, it's key to 6.2 and the authorization of ITMOs. It's also relevant to crosses over 6.4 when we're talking about what are authorized 6.4 units for NDCs or otherwise, or not authorized. So it's a crossover. And there's a real tension between the flexibility to decide what something is authorized for and potentially changing a view on what that is authorized for, or enabling a participating party, maybe a private entity to be in, is authorized, or maybe changing that view. And that was of focus for both the business community and the organizations, the parties involved, and it just was unable to be resolved, and it was dropped in the final text. But I don't, you know, if there was two things that came out of Article 6 you need to know, it's one about mitigation contribution ERs, very big development, and two, watch this space on this whole authorization debate, because it could have real value impact on investments or the nature of units. If you have thought you were going to get a corresponding adjusted backed unit under one of these mechanisms, and it's later decided by the country on changing the authorization to something else, what would that mean for you as a buyer or an investor? So it is an important topic. Now if we just move on. And then so we just wanted to wrap it up. This is all been about new mechanisms under the Paris Agreement, but clearly we do have deep, vibrant, voluntary carbon markets that have been sort of picking up the slack from the international community, you could say, but need to now interface and work with developments. And then we saw a lot of announcements at COP around the ambition, not necessarily just in voluntary carbon markets, but in carbon markets generally. And I think it would be useful to get sort of a country perspective here. And if I brought Renata in, you know, I guess you're living the tension or the discussions of grappling with what is the role for voluntary markets versus what is national policies around carbon. Did you want to chip in with some thoughts?
Yeah, Andrew, thanks so much. I think I'm gonna pick your statement on the fact that it's almost all about national implementation. I mean, these discussions have to have good results nationally, otherwise it will simply not work. In Brazil, we have been having lots of discussions around how to implement that, and we had a decree and now discussions again around a bill of law that would regulate what would be our regulated market, but also kind of regulate the voluntary market, what is somehow scary because you never know how it may affect the willingness of investors to keep going with relevant projects in Brazil. I think the momentum is great for Brazil in the sense that there is an appetite for investment again. But I would maybe highlight for the companies that are watching us, the clients, two major movements that I see that are important now in Brazil. The first one is really the sectors to organize themselves, to have a very transparent discussion on what are the targets, what are the reasonable commitments, and how to present that to the government, and how to learn from the other countries and how the sectors organized in countries that already have a regulated market. And the second recommendation would be to be really prepared for advocacy. I think this is a great moment to take these lessons, as I mentioned, the lessons learned from other countries, and try to influence in a good way the government to have a framework that really works. Otherwise, we may see what we saw during the Kyoto scheme, was the fact that we lost many investments in Brazil for other countries, other neighbors that were more prepared and were really giving more comfortable to investors from the perspective of regulations and legal framework that gives this comfort to investors. So that would be my highlights here.
Well, thank you, Renata. Just in the interest of time, let's move on to our next topic. Have the slides moving on. So climate finance, we'll just go on one more. I'm just very relatively brief overview on this, because we're going to leave time for some interesting discussions at the end on biodiversity. But David touched on this, you know, finance is increasingly difficult conversation at each COP because there is a continuing sort of paucity of meeting prior pledges and a lot of perhaps legitimate critique that flows to date have not been at the scale or speed or efficiency needed to enable countries really to deliver what they would like to deliver. But you can see the numbers here are quite staggering, that the trillions required, and that sort of brings up the question that comes up regularly in this around what are the sort of the optimal ways in which private investment can be leveraged in, because there is probably not sufficient, so even if there was a game changer in terms of developed countries' commitments, would not be sufficient. And that I think is probably key to where things will develop. And some of the discussion we've had around this on Article 6, but other tools that are emerging could be the ways in which that is unlocked for developing countries. If we just move on to the next slide. So what was some of the goals that came out in the implementation plan there? So there was again a constant focus on adaptation, which has really moved from the sort of the poor cousin of discussions of some say 5 years ago to being quite a critical one. You've seen that evolution as we've had to live with extreme weather events, that people started realizing that it's not just about mitigation, it's about adapting to climate change. And that in turn has led to the conversation about loss and damage, as people realize it's not just adaptation, but it's fundamentally about irreversible impacts, and how is that going to be dealt with. As David said, I think it was a breakthrough moment for developing countries to get something on loss and damage, but whether it remains a relatively underfunded initiative for some years is quite possible. I would say though that the nature of the UN processes are that once something is created, it just tends to live on and grow, and something is always happening. So it might not be quick, but you could definitely see that over time, this fund will become something important, or at least something that is a focus of conversation. If we just go on to the next slide. And this was another topic that was quite big at COP this year around, and David touched on this, the just energy transition and what that means in practice for countries. But there was not just sort of conversation, there were proper announcements. Interestingly, to pick up that point earlier, announcements which indicated the bringing together of both public and private funds. But I guess, David, bringing you in, what's your take on just transition and I guess the US's role in this?
But I mean, this is a major issue. On the one hand, it was nice to see the US try and play a more active leading role. At the same time, much of the funding that's referenced here is derivative of the Inflation Reduction Act and some provisions that were made for in that. And the challenge will be both particularly in the US with the change in the House side of Congress, but other countries as well, that as nice as these developments are, they're almost kind of a drop in the bucket compared to the numbers you had on the slide earlier, Andrew, about the magnitude of the need. So while one looks with some encouragement at these developments, they're relatively small compared to what's needed. And I'm probably a little more cautious about, or less optimistic about, public finance being made available at the levels needed, which I think is only going to increase the pressure on the private sector, including companies, to do more rather than less, both in relation to their own performance as well as providing additional financing or opportunities for others. So, I mean, I think net this is going to be a huge area to follow, and I think the pressure on companies is only going to grow, and derivatively, that's going to also mean that carbon markets as well, the importance of them will continue to grow as companies need to find ways to evidence that they're meeting the demands expected of them, while those markets are becoming more complicated for the reasons you were alluding to, as well as debates within the sector about what does quality and integrity of credits really mean.
Good. Well, just keep.
I mean, this is where the fights are going to be. It's going to be about money and who pays.
Yes, and in a world where that's becoming more expensive, debt is not as cheap as it was. But let's move on, because we wanted to stick to time and wanted to bring Renata in on biodiversity, because she will be there at the next biodiversity conference, and it's a very interesting development.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, we are in an interesting moment now, just digesting the results of COP27 and getting ready for COP15 on biodiversity. So I think that is not new for anyone that biodiversity was and has been a subject of increased attention, and it was not different at COP27. In fact, we had, for example, a day that was dedicated to biodiversity and discussions around, for example, oceans and impacts on ecosystems and how it interacts with climate. Biodiversity is not a specific focus of the Paris Agreement, but the agreement recognizes its importance and the importance to conserve and enhance natural sinks of greenhouse gases as one of the tools to reach the climate-related goals. For example, Article 5.2 establishes the support to conserve forests, and the establishment of REDD+ projects. This is one of the examples that we have around biodiversity in connection with climate. So as we know, the frameworks for climate and biodiversity are different. We have, from the biodiversity side, the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, which will be discussed in Montreal this month, as you mentioned. The major goal of COP15 is, in fact, to approve what is called the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which defines targets and pathways for conservation and sustainability. I would highlight here, and I know that we don't have much time left, but I would highlight target 15 is one of the targets of this framework, which expects all business to assess and report on their dependencies and impacts on biodiversity. Also to reduce negative impacts and to increase positive impacts. This is in fact huge, because depending on the sort of negotiations, and it's very open now, in fact, we had a first draft that was circulated, but there are many issues to be negotiated at COP15. So one of the issues is how this target will affect businesses going forward, because in fact, we don't have nationally, in many places at least, obligations to assess and report this type of dependencies on biodiversity and nor the impacts. So this will be, in fact, one of the major discussions that we'll face. With that, as we saw at COP27, we'll probably see discussions around finance and the tracking of the impacts on biodiversity. As you mentioned, I'll be there with another partner. We'll have big teams from the private sector following these discussions. Differently from what we have at the climate framework, we don't have here a mechanism for biodiversity credits. This is a discussion that is not expected to be detailed now, but this is something that we'll probably start facing nationally. We have more and more countries, as Australia, for example, working to implement this kind of credits as a mechanism to track and to establish benefits for companies that are already developing their own policies regardless the international convention. So I think that the idea here is really to follow that. It is the next big issue to be discussed, and it's completely closed and connected with climate. So let's see, probably in the near future, we will be here discussing carbon and biodiversity credits as very important instruments going forward.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. We are on time, which is good. Thank you to all of our speakers to sticking to time. We've been checking, we've had a relatively shy audience today, so we haven't had any questions coming in. So I think we're going to wrap up on time and just thank everyone for their participation, their listening, and hope we hear from you again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.